In the last video I showed you that the events of AD 70, when Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans and the temple was completely destroyed, had been predicted by Jesus and also by the Old Testament prophet Daniel. At that time, and after another Jewish revolt against the Romans in AD 135, many Jews did indeed fall by the sword, and many were taken as prisoners to the nations, as Jesus had said. We also considered Jesus' prophecy about the times of the Gentiles, and how that one day this age of the Gentiles will come to a close. But what sign should we expect of the end of this age? Jesus actually hinted at one of those signs when he first told his disciples of the times of the Gentiles, because the end of this age will mean a new status for the Jews and for Jerusalem. Notice that Jesus didn't say that the Jews would remain dispersed in all the nations forever. He didn't say that Jerusalem would be in the hands of the Gentiles forever. He said that it would be that way until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. This isn't the only prophecy in the Bible which sees Israel as a nation in the land of Palestine when Jesus comes again. There are many more. Indeed, when you study biblical prophecy about the future, hardly anything makes any sense at all without the existence of a Jewish state. Yet such a possibility seemed completely fanciful until fairly recently. For centuries the Jews had been scattered across the world, and the land of Palestine was inhabited by Arabs. Even Christians thought that it was unlikely that the Jews would ever return, and they began to teach that the huge number of predictions about Israel as a nation in the Bible ought not to be taken literally, but rather had a deeper spiritual meaning relating to the church itself. However, in the late 19th century, a man called Theodor Herzl founded what was called the Zionist movement, and that movement in 1917, in the midst of the First World War, persuaded the British government to agree to a national home for the Jewish people. It took another world war before the nation of Israel was finally born in 1948, as the terrible Nazi Holocaust of the Jews resulted in a flood of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. But what had seemed absurd just a few decades earlier had become a reality. There is no greater sign of the end of this age than the fact that Israel exists as a nation in Palestine, and that even now, every year, thousands of Jews from all over the world are returning to their homeland. But what about the future? What other things must happen for Israel before the end of the age? Did you know that the Bible also speaks of a Jewish temple in Jerusalem before the end? Consider Jesus' words again. In Matthew 24, verse 15 to 16, the language that he uses is similar to the passage I pointed out before, but the event that he is describing is very different. It is an event that comes to pass at the end of this age. He said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Jesus is talking about a most abominable act of desecration, and it is the same abominable act that Daniel spoke about in Daniel 9 verse 27 at the end of his 70 weeks prophecy. Paul also spoke about it in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4 and gives more details about what will happen. He said, "Concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for the day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Jesus, Daniel, and Paul were all pointing to the same future event. They were talking about the actions of a man in the future called the Antichrist, whom I will discuss later in another video. But did you notice where the abominable act will take place? The holy place, God's temple. Since AD 70, the Jewish temple has not even existed. So how could these things possibly happen unless the temple was to be rebuilt? Right now, this prospect of the Jews building a temple in Jerusalem seems pretty absurd. There seem to be too many obstacles. For a start, Jewish rabbinical law forbids entry to the Temple Mount site in Jerusalem, and many Jews believe that this ban must stay in place until their Messiah comes. And the biggest obstacle of all surely is that the site of the temple already has a building on it, the Dome of the Rock, sacred to Muslims everywhere and as a place where Muhammad himself is said to have ascended into heaven. How could a new Jewish temple be built without the Dome of the Rock being destroyed? And such an act of aggression against another religion would be completely unacceptable to millions of the people the world over. But believe it or not, the Bible has actually got the answer to this problem. The Jewish temple will be rebuilt, but the Temple Mount will be shared by Jews and Gentiles. In the book of the Revelation, chapter 11, verse 1 to 2, we read, "I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and was told, Go and measure the temple of God and the altar, and count the worshippers there, but exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months." It has always been assumed that the Dome of the Rock that Muslims regard as sacred stands on the site of the Holy of Holies of the ancient Jewish temple, so that any future temple would need to replace the Dome on the Rock, and that no other place would do. But there are new archaeological theories that place the Holy of Holies, at least the Holy of Holies of the first Jewish temple, someplace to the north or south of the Dome of the Rock. With these new archaeological theories, and with the possibility of peace between Jews and Muslims, with one of the most controversial issues of their conflict being resolved, you would expect that archaeologists would be rushing to the site to investigate. But there is so much mistrust between the two parties that archaeological investigation is almost impossible. But how long will it take before someone comes along and tells the two groups what seems to many to be blindingly obvious? They will need to share the holy site. We know that a temple will be rebuilt, and the site will be shared. We know it because biblical prophecy has shown itself to be reliable in the past, and will show itself to be reliable in the future too.